Live, Die, Repeat games are ubiquitous with modern game design. Like Soulsborne titles or games with deceptive in-game economies and gambling mechanics that want to cheat you out of your money, Live, Die, Repeat games are everywhere these days. Whether it be indie roguelikes like Hades or AAA titles like the recent-ish Returnal, many games transform the very act of death and failure into a core part of gameplay progression. In these titles, the player is meant to die over and over again, sometimes even in hilarious fashion. And this is built into the given game's story and level design. It is a fundamental part of these games. Deathloop is another one of these time loop titles, albeit a terrific stealth action shooter version. As a PlayStation 5 and PC exclusive title by Dishonored and Prey developer Arkane Studios, Deathloop fits the Live, Die, Repeat descriptor to a T. The game stars the main protagonist Colt, and throughout the game, he, along with everyone else on the island of Black Reef, is stuck in a time loop where he and they live the same day over and over again, Groundhog Day style. And most of the island's residents are unaware that they're living the same day over and over again. But unlike them, Colt remembers that he's part of an endless loop where every day is exactly the same, 9 Inch Nails style. And in order to break this endless loop, he must assassinate 8 particularly dangerous people referred to as visionaries in one single day, which is a task that is easier said than done. After all, the visionaries are generally protected by many a hapless henchman, and the visionaries themselves are well armed and have slabs, which essentially give them superpowers like teleportation, invisibility, a rage mode, and the works. It is a lot, and in order to overcome this, Colt must investigate the visionaries, find out their weaknesses throughout the day, and discover the mysteries of Black Reef so that he can piece together a plan where he can kill all the visionaries in one single go and break the loop. Deathloop's Live, Die, Repeat concept and its execution of that said concept is terrific, and its greatness starts with its ingenious level design. The game has 4 large stages located on different areas of Black Reef that all have their own level design intricacies and nuances. For example, Updam is a town, Carl's Bay is a coastal location, Freestad Rock is a weapons testing area, and the complex has more to do with Black Reef's utilities. But regardless of location, they all have their own layouts, enemies, and bases of operations for the visionaries. They are quite unique. This is especially true when factoring in the time of day. See, depending on whether it is morning, midday, afternoon, or night, the enemy locations and even certain aspects of the map's geography are changed, whether it be the enemy patrols, secret passageways, critical lore details, weapon locations, or the accessibility of visionary hideouts. Certain aspects of Deathloop's maps change throughout the day depending on the time, and this is crucial, mostly because the time, which can only be advanced in between missions, adds further nuances and dimension to these maps, and when replaying these maps at specific times of the day, the levels instill their own sense of character within the player. Even beyond characters like Colt or the rest of the visionaries, the locations and their layouts, depending on the time of day, leave an impression on you. They have an identity and a personality to them as you replay these maps over and over again. They all just have a distinct feel. The knowledge we accrue by replaying these locales at specific times of day over and over again affects a lot of Deathloop's early gameplay progression. See, after dying amid each loop or reaching the end of the day without killing all the visionaries, Colt restarts the loop with a bare minimum amount of weapons and upgrades. He has a double jump ability, a machete, a mulligan slab that essentially gives him lives, and a weak as shit submachine gun that jams all the freaking time. And at the day's start, or at least in the early game, Colt must venture forth with the same limited amount of tools and must acquire better items and weapons throughout his day before ultimately losing them as a result of failing to close the loop yet again, which is hardly an optimal situation for Colt. This admittedly sounds more brutal and futile than it actually is. See, the most important element of gameplay progression in Deathloop is not in accruing items over the course of many runs, though that does happen in the later stages of the game. Instead, Deathloop's most important facet of gameplay progression is in regards to the knowledge you accrue as the game goes on. In fact, you become familiar with the game's maps and environments at every specific time of day, and over time you learn the enemy patrol patterns, you know when enemies vacate certain areas, and you find out the best way to infiltrate a visionary's base of operations, and due to this you become a better player. We learn the ins and outs of these maps as time goes on, and in turn this allows us, the player, to mitigate our mistakes in future runs. Sure, Colt Cult fails a lot in the early going, but these cock-ups serve as learning experiences. By failing, we learn what areas to avoid and that we must alter our strategy, meaning that the true lesson of Deathloop is the fuck-ups we commit along the way. For a good example of this, when say infiltrating a visionary's hideout, we might die horrifically by trying to bum rush a base and enter via the front door, which is a bad idea. But over time, we may discover alternate ways to enter the visionary base. We might discover back ways inside their facility or other vulnerabilities to use to our advantage that makes the player's job easier in future loops. And with that, the player progresses by learning the terrain there. They learn by experiencing their various miscues. This is just terrific game design, mostly because it forces the player to study the game's world in order to know the best way to approach combat encounters. A good example of this is when entering Freestad Rock at noon. At this location and at that specific time, there are enemies just outside the area where you exit your hideout, essentially just outside your spawn point. And on the first few loops, this turns into a frenetic FPS firefight between Colt and these various enemies. But on subsequent loops, the player wisens up on their earlier failures and use them as learning experiences. And from there, the player can slowly but surely formulate a more stealthier, safer, and faster plan where Colt sneaks around without suspicion as he murders people with a machete like the little Jason Voorhees impersonator that he is. In other words, we the player learn valuable lessons from previous failed loops on Freestad Rock that allows us to improve as players. And honestly, that's just a great form of gameplay progression that is focused on the player learning more about the game and its world, more so than just acquiring better gear. It is well done. Of course, there is eventually some important progression tied to the gameplay later on in the game as well. Eventually, Colt learns how to infuse his weapons with a quantum-based element called Residium, a resource that the player can collect in 3 distinct ways. The player can collect Residium from the visionaries that Colt kills, the player can be rewarded with Residium when sacrificing lesser weapons and gear whilst in between missions, and Colt can harvest specific Residium-filled objects on Black Reef. And in Colt's hideout in between missions, the player can infuse weapons, upgrades, and the superpowered slabs with this Residium in order to keep these items through every subsequent playthrough. The player can use these items in every loop going forward. And as a result, the player becomes stronger and stronger as the game goes on, as they gain more items that they can stockpile and equip between missions. And when combined with the player's increased knowledge of the world and the various maps and times of day later on in the game, the player grows exponentially when compared to earlier in the game, which is just terrific design. After all, it is important for the player to feel like they're progressing in the world and the game, and with the player learning the maps to improve their strategies and the player literally becoming stronger over time with more powerful weapons, powers, and gear, you become a better player as the game goes on. There is a meaningful progression here. Deathloop's gameplay is awesome on a fundamental level as well. The FPS combat is smooth and crisp, the stealth is very rewarding when you execute it well, and the powers like the teleportation shift, invisibility called Aether, and others give the gameplay a lot of dimension and drastically change how you interact with the game and its world. And overall, it is quite excellent and honestly plays like a streamlined version of the Dishonored series, which quite frankly is probably by design. Like Dishonored, Deathloop is a stealth action experience where you can sneak around stabbing people, go headfirst into combat, and try to overpower your enemies with your weaponry, or mix and match between the two. And similar to Dishonored, the player has weapons and abilities for each hand. The right hand is reserved for weapons like pistols, machine guns, or Colt's melee attack that comes in the form of a machete, and the left hand is used for slab powers, grenades, a hacking machine, and dual-wieldable guns. And like Dishonored, Deathloop is about mixing and matching between all these tools in order to help you succeed in any given combat scenario. For a few examples, hacking machine gun turrets can be beneficial, teleporting can help you reach better vantage points, and if you're caught being stealthy, Carnesis can give you a combat edge, because telekinesis. Regardless of what you do though, Deathloop has a lot of avenues for you to explore its world and combat its enemies, which is very Dishonored-like. But with that being said though, Deathloop is more than just a Dishonored clone. In fact, Deathloop is actually an advancement and a refinement of the mechanics that were introduced in the Dishonored franchise. Because truly, Dishonored and Dishonored 2 were good, albeit imperfect experiences. See, as good as Dishonored and Dishonored 2 are, the gameplay does have some issues in regards to gameplay flow. For a few examples, the games featured way too many inventory options when it came to powers, tools, and weapons. The games emphasized the importance of hiding dead or unconscious bodies, which in and of itself isn't a bad thing, but it often feels like a distraction in that game at times. And most importantly, Dishonored and Dishonored 2's morality system was fucked. The games tied their good endings and their bad endings to whether or not you killed a lot of people during your playthrough, or if your methods were chaotic, meaning that if you mostly resolved your problems stealthily, you got the good ending, and if you had a higher body count than Patrick Bateman, you earned the bad ending. You sick fuck. Which is honestly a core fundamental problem with Dishonored and Dishonored 2's design. Whenever the player is caught sneaking, there isn't really a viable option to get out of these jams without murdering those who discovered you, which is an action that, if committed too many times, will potentially get you the bad ending in the game, which sucks. And speaking for myself, I always reloaded saves whenever I got caught so that I could go back to a point in the game where I hadn't been busted by the guards yet, all because I wanted the good conclusion at the end. And due to this, my progression in Dishonored and Dishonored 2 often grinded to a halt, because I spent so much time reloading saves almost every time I was caught by enemies. I essentially kept stopping the game and ruined the gameplay flow, which is also an action that in turn caused me to save after almost every time I incapacitated a guard. I essentially stopped my game every minute to save manually because I feared the moments that I would inevitably be caught and lose my progress. And because of all these stoppages of play, whether it be through manually saving or reloading saves, Dishonored and Dishonored 2 had a very stop-and-go feel. The game unintentionally conditions the player to save after every single good move that they make and reload to a previous save whenever they inevitably make a shitty mistake. A shit stake. It is a problem. Thankfully, Deathloop features none of these issues though. As a true refinement of Arkane's previous games, Deathloop fixes basically all of the problems that plagued Dishonored and Dishonored 2. Its inventory, weapons, upgrades, and powers are comparatively much more manageable and easier to keep track of. Dead bodies automatically disappear after death because of the time loop, meaning that you don't have to waste time hiding the people you've dispatched. The endings are no longer tied to morality, which means you can just go to town by just wailing on people mercilessly with no negative repercussions. And last but not least, Deathloop only autosaves. There are no manual saves, which means that when you, the player, eventually fucks up worse than Brexit, you have to see your mistake through. You can't reload a save, which makes sense after all, because failure is a core fundamental part of the game. As stated before, the game's progression is tied from you learning the maps and from your mistakes, and the game wisely doesn't have any form of manual saves and minimal autosaves. In fact, the game only saves after you complete a stage or upon your death. And this is a good thing, because the player messing up is all part of the experience, because we're a bunch of losers, and honestly, Deathloop is all the better for it. The gameplay has a flow to it that doesn't get severed like it did in the stop-and-go Dishonored. The player doesn't need to fret about reloading a save after being caught, because 1, there are no manual saves, and 2, the subsequent screw-up and the firefights with the security alerted to your presence are a core part of the game as well, because you have to learn from your mistakes. Failure is all part of Deathloop's experience, and losing just gives the player an excuse to reformulate a plan and try again, which once again is great design. Of course, each loop has a hair of unpredictability. In fact, even the best laid plans can run into a hitch, mostly in the form of Juliana, i.e. Colt's kryptonite, i.e. one of the best parts of Deathloop. See, unlike all the other enemies in the game, Juliana can be controlled by another actual player who invades your game Dark Souls style and attempts to foil your plans to murder the other visionaries because she just has to be Colt's Debbie Downer. With Juliana, the invading player is equipped with the character-exclusive Masquerade slab that disguises her appearance, and some other slabs depending on the player's loadout. And from there, fighting Juliana is a satisfying game of cat and mouse, as Juliana tries to thwart your plans. And honestly, these confrontations are a lot of fun, mostly because in a game about planning the perfect hit, Juliana adds an air of unpredictability to the proceedings. She keeps us, the player, on our toes. Furthermore, Juliana is a great character in her own right. Voiced by Osakia Akaga, Juliana is also a aware that she is in a time loop and plays with Colt much like how I play with a delectable bowl of tortellini, because it's fucking delicious. And with Juliana, Deathloop delivers a terrific antagonist who is confident in her schemes. She is a focused force to be reckoned with, which perfectly complements the protagonist, Colt. As a character, Colt comparatively does not have his shit together. When attempting his various schemes, he, and by extension the player, often bungles his plans, falling ass backwards into various angry hornets' nests that all desire to shoot him in the face. And as a result, Juliana is a terrific yin to Colt's yang. She is his opposite, and there is some terrific depth and character here. This is impressive from a storytelling and performance standpoint. As a game, most of Deathloop is void of cutscenes, and most of the character building is entirely done through audio recordings and radio communications, meaning that the performances and the writing really do the heavy lifting when it comes to conveying the narrative, and surprisingly, Deathloop pulls this off excellently. The performances by Akaga as Juliana and Jason E. Kelly as Colt are terrific, and the barbs and insults they trade with one another really build a tumultuous adversarial relationship where they both try to one-up one another. It is just quality character development through performance. Additionally, the rest of the Visionaries are well voiced as well. Through the performances and the writing, we really understand why these characters are loathsome, which really further gives the player and Colt motivation to assassinate them. For example, Alexis is a pompous prick, Charlie Montague is full of himself, and the rest of the Visionaries fall on a scale between asshole and psychopath. It's just good character building that is mostly done through the script and vocal performances, all of which are really good. On the whole, Deathloop is a great game, but it is not one without flaws. For one thing, some of the enemy AI is suspect. See, sometimes when I was caught amid my awful attempts to be stealthy, the AI would sometimes act predictably and try to swarm me from the same location, and I essentially picked them off one at a time as I bottlenecked them as if they were my own miniature version of the Battle of Thermopylae. And in these instances, I wish that the AI would have been more creative when they were trying to kill me. I wish that they would have flanked me more often or something along those lines. The game was just a bit too forgiving there. Another problem comes with the slabs. While for sure the superpowered slabs are awesome and a lot of fun, I honestly did not feel compelled to experiment with many of them once I found a slab combination that worked for me. See, you are only allowed to equip 2 slabs, and I generally just stuck with my teleportation shift ability and my invisibility aether one, which is unfortunate because most slabs do serve a purpose and can fundamentally change the gameplay for the better, mostly. And while I understand that limiting the number of slabs that the player can equip at one time was meant as an effort to streamline the game compared to Dishonored, which, let me be clear again, is overall a great thing, the fact remains that the restriction does have an unintended side effect of making it so you might not want to experiment with the other cool superpowers that you have. It sadly causes you to avoid experimentation. Another issue is the multiple endings. See, when I reached the end of the game, which I won't spoil here, I made the mistake of thinking that I was in a cutscene when I was actually in live gameplay and could interact with the world and affect Deathloop's overall conclusion, something that is not made clear to the player in the game. See, most games give you button prompts that inform you that you have a choice over the narrative and the ending, but these prompts were oddly absent in Deathloop's finale. In the game's conclusion, there are certain choices that you can make, but the game sadly never informs you that you're in live gameplay, and to make matters worse, your decision has a time limit. And speaking from my own playthrough, if you do not interact with the game, Deathloop essentially decides for you what the ending will be before you realize too late that this ending sequence was not a cutscene. The game, for me, just was not clear that this was an interactable moment, and it kind of sucks, mostly because Deathloop forced me to have an ending that was counterintuitive to my understanding of Colt as a character and the way I understood the narrative. And while I thankfully do not have to replay the whole game to get to the ending that I want, this was still a miscue in terms of Deathloop's design. It was a mistake. One last problem involves the online connectivity. See, I usually wasn't able to connect with Deathloop servers, which is a big deal taking in the fact that other players are supposed to invade your game as Juliana, and the player can invade the games of other cults. But sadly, I wasn't able to partake in much of Deathloop's online offerings because I couldn't connect with the game's servers. I never got a chance to play as Juliana herself, and to be clear, this was not a problem on my end. My PlayStation 5 was always connected to the PlayStation Network, and my Wi-Fi was close by and firing on all cylinders. Yet even despite this, I have been having connectivity issues that have prevented me from experiencing some of the best portions of the game. I am literally missing features here. Still, these problems are not deal breakers. They are notable flaws, sure, but they do not ultimately derail the experience. And with that, Deathloop is overall an awesome game. As a title, Deathloop is a terrific stealth action shooter with effective streamlined gameplay and awesome vocal performances. While there are some minor issues in regards to AI and the endings, the fluid gameplay, the wonderful vocal performances and characterizations, and the slick execution of its time loop premise reign supreme. It is ultimately a game worth reliving for. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating and subscribe to my channel. Ring the bell so that you're notified for whenever I release a new video. Also, leave a comment telling me what you think of Deathloop, Arkane Studios, and time loop games in general. Additionally, please consider checking out my Patreon page. The link is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, especially my high tier ones, and David, Samantha, Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.